Cairns, the tropical centre of far north Queensland. Here you have perfect winters, humid summers and sunny Saturdays at the lagoon. Over 2.5 million visitors arrive every year into the region, discovering the reefs, beaches and rainforests. But it wasn't always this way. Back in the 1930s, Cairns was just a laid-back country town, with a population of just under 15,000 people representing a wide range of nationalities. It was safe, and people would leave their doors and windows unlocked because it was so hot. There was little electricity, which meant no refrigeration, so residents would buy an ice block to put in the cold box, and people mostly ate fresh bread and produce. Tropical lows and the wet season made the sugarcane grow, and the timber and fishing industries were also booming.
Oh, it was a little place, not like it is now. You know, they had the hospital right on the sort of on the beach, and there was nothing much around. Oh, they had a couple of dance halls.
There was a lot of swamp areas down here around Cairns, you know. Look, there's all houses there now, of course, it's all filled in.
Just over 80 years ago, on the 3rd of September 1939, after Germany had invaded Poland, Britain declared war on Germany. Australia was an ally of Britain's, which meant Australia was now at war too. The first squadron of Australian airmen arrived in Britain on Boxing Day, 1939. Initially, 20,000 Australian troops were sent to North Africa to set up an offensive home base close to Europe, with tens of thousands more to follow. The war overseas seemed too far away to reach Australian shores, with minimal changes around Cairns. A northern alert was then issued to begin defensive preparations. This could mainly be seen in the closure of the Cairns wharves to the public, with a permit system in place, and militia guards placed at vital points to protect the main roads, bridges, oil depots and power stations. Cairns Aerodrome also began upgrading its runways to accommodate much larger planes.
Well, before 1939, the aerodrome was just a gravel strip and only suitable for smallish planes. When the army came in and took over, they widened it, they lengthened it, they bitumened the surface so that the heavy military aircraft could use it.
Because of the European war, the local Australian government was concerned about spies and was suspicious of foreigners already living here. Because of this, they placed German and Italian Australians into internment camps around the country.
They suffered terribly, they really did, just because of their nationality. And they were interned. I believe there was an internment camp at Home Hill that they were put to work as farm labourers, sort of growing vegetables and things like that.
Due to the German and Italian Australians' internment, the Cairns sugar industry began to suffer. The best farmers had been taken away. It was heartbreaking for innocent families, whose male counterparts were the ones to go, leaving the women to manage the farms on their own.
And of course, you know, the cane had to still be harvested, and in most cases the women of the Italian internees managed the farm in their absence, which was a cruel decision, I believe. But you know, in those times there were decisions that you look back in later years and think, you know, that just wasn't right.
Then, on the 27th of September 1940, Japan, who was already at war with Indochina, joined Germany and Italy in an agreement called the Axis. In a move similar to the Italians and Germans 12 months earlier, now the men in every Japanese family were also interned. This forced businesses to close, and the Japanese silk used to make ladies' dresses disappeared from Cairns shelves. A major turning point of World War II was when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, bringing America into the war on the 7th of December 1941. 2 months later, Singapore was taken over by Japan on the 15th of February 1942. Remaining Allied troops continued the fighting in Europe, but had to now be divided to go to New Guinea, Horn Island and surrounds as the fighting began inching closer to Australia. Just 4 days after Singapore was captured, Darwin, which is located just under 2,500 kilometres northwest of Cairns, was bombed by Japanese fighters. This really brought things closer to home. The thought of Cairns shores being attacked by the enemy meant we weren't safe. Evacuations were encouraged, but not compulsory. Women and children fled almost overnight. 78% of Cairns children left the town.
We went up and I think from memory there was 25 of us boys. I think the youngest was only 7, I think. And, you know, it was a sort of a thing to first time away from home and at such a young age.
The Cairns population had almost halved instantly. Some people sold their houses and belongings. Others just walked out, leaving everything they owned.
Yeah, to get away and not be in this area, thinking that the Japanese were coming down. Well, to be quite honest, they were too.
In June of 1942, the Japanese commenced airstrikes down the east coast of Australia. Some thoughts are that they were actually intending to strike Cairns, but due to the enforced nightly blackouts, they may have missed the town in the darkness and continued on towards Townsville, where over several nights bombs were dropped, but missed their targets, with many landing in the ocean. On the 31st of June 1942, however, a Japanese aircraft did drop 8 bombs just north of Mossman. While many fell in farmers' paddocks or the sea, one landed in Myallo, just 50 metres behind a nearby house, and exploded. Pieces of shrapnel flew into the side of the house where a young 2.5-year-old child was sleeping. She survived, but pieces of metal grazed her skull. Due to the fear of airborne attacks, 57 public air raid shelters were built between Mackay and Cairns, with the council building 9 around Cairns itself. The shelters were a rectangular box design, reinforced with concrete that was 300 millimetres thick, and each one housed 50 people. After the war, most of these shelters were demolished, but today there are 2 left standing, one in Babinda and the other at Norman Park in Gordonvale. Private households also had makeshift air raid shelters. Some were small buildings, and others were trenches called slits and dug out in backyards. The neighbours knew who had the best shelter in the street. Generally, everyone pitched in and helped one another during this time. On Sunday nights, a siren would go off in Cairns so that everyone could practice air raid drills.
Always at school, we always had to do that. And you had to carry a little bag with a thing to put in your mouth and muffs for your ears. And they had dug trenches so that, and then they'd have the siren go off, and so that we could go. When that happened, everything stopped in the schoolrooms, and then we'd have to run down in a line and keep quiet, and also get into the trenches.
The only trouble is that when it rained, it got half filled with water. I can remember that.
In Munro Martin Park, in the centre of town, what is now known as the Scout Shop was then the Civil Defence Communications Centre and Control Room, run by the Volunteer Defence Corps, or VDC, and was founded by the Returned Soldiers League. It was crucial as a communication headquarters, as well as a first aid post and shelter. It was reinforced with 300mm thick concrete walls and was used by the VDC, police, fire brigade and ambulance services. In early 1941, the Gillies Range Road was the only way up to the tablelands for vehicles from Cairns.
The Gillies in those days was only one-way traffic. It was a narrow gravel road, so not the best sort of roads to go on.
So commencing in 1940, the Kuranda Range Road was built as an alternative route to the northern tablelands. With over 100 men working on it, the Kuranda Range Road began to take shape. The men would climb up and down the range to get to where their worksite was every day. It was finally opened in mid-1941, but was modified to accommodate heavier military vehicles from June 1942.
That was like a lifeline for up there, because I know people used to have to come down with pack animals.
This would become one of the most utilised roads during the wartime effort in Cairns, opening up smaller townships like Mareeba, where things were just getting started. By the end of 1942, Mareeba's population of 2,500 people had grown to over 10,000 with the arrival of the US and Australian troops. They came by train, truck and plane. It was no longer the quiet farming town it once was, with some saying Mareeba never slept.
Especially over the road from us, as I said, the Americans had this house that made into a headquarters and that. Well, in our yard at home, we had fruit trees. I used to take over armfuls over to the Americans, and they thought it was wonderful. And I thought it was really great because I'd come home with Hoadley crumble bars and chewing gum. We used to flog them over there with all the fruit in the world.
The pace of life sped up quickly in 1942 with the Mareeba airfield modifications needed to accommodate the heavy bombers and fighter planes. It was completed in a record time of just 8 days. This was no easy feat, with the troops building the airfield with whatever tools they could find. There was a huge influx of soldiers from all around the world, following the decision to make it the main operational airfield in far north Queensland.
The Public Works Department had to rebuild the strip, make it longer, wider, stronger and tougher for the American flying fortresses and Liberators to land on the airstrip.
I worked on Liberators. Oh, they were big, big planes. But I enjoyed every minute of it.
The locals of Mareeba desperately wanted to pitch in and help the troops out. Many volunteered their services to the army, and when the women of Mareeba found out the troops didn't have enough to eat, they opened their kitchens.
My mum was a very good cook. She could make brilliant scones and cakes, and she used to take these over to the soldiers in the paddock, and they used to meet her at the wire fence, and she'd hand these over to them. And then in the end they started to call my mum Auntie.
The troops trained hard all over the tablelands, taking part in the famous jungle training to prepare them for conditions overseas, often battling mosquitoes, sandflies and cane toads, followed by monsoonal rains. Sometimes jungle training included going down the Kuranda Range through the scrub and back up the mountain on foot, all in one day.
They had to get used to jungle warfare because they were destined to go to Papua New Guinea. And of course, certain parts of, especially in the highlands and on the northern side of the island, it's pretty much thick with jungle, and as much like the Atherton Tableland where the Australian forces were doing their training. So they really had to get used to jungle warfare, wet conditions, the stinging trees and the leeches and things like that. So it was basically just training for when they would go into combat duty.
The tablelands also became a place of rest and recuperation. Lake Barine had a guest house with diving boards over the lake, and over at Lake Ejim, the Army also built jetty stairs and held swimming carnivals. Troops spread out to 160 camps across the region. Business started to boom. By 1943, there were between 50,000 and 100,000 troops quartered on the Atherton-Evelyn tablelands, with a corps of 40,000 soldiers at any one time. For the men fighting against the Japanese in New Guinea, the swampy marshlands were a great breeding ground for mosquitoes carrying malaria. Malaria was a nasty disease that didn't discriminate between the Allies or their enemies. Some soldiers stated at the time that if they didn't kill each other, then the malaria would. With the fighting really heating up across the sea and a malaria epidemic in New Guinea, it was crucial for Australians to be prepared. Luckily, a new war hospital was built on the Atherton Tablelands, just near Tolga. It was called Rocky Creek Hospital and was opened on October 20th, 1942, just in time to begin extensive malaria research and treat troops returning from overseas.
There was quite a big, as it was the largest hospital, military hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. Remarkable. Yeah. A tent city, if you want to put it that way. I think the only main permanent building was the igloo, which sort of doubled up as a cinema and recreation hall for the soldiers that were there, and plus the patience.
Back in Cairns, the Women's Junior Auxiliary of the Returned Sailors and Soldiers Imperial League of Australia held farewell dinners at the RSL for troops from all around the world. Cairns was the last stop before New Guinea, and departing troops had no one to wave them goodbye. The ladies would volunteer their time to cook dinner, dance, and then be up early to wave them off at the wharf. On the 4th of May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea began. This was only just over 1,000 kilometres from Cairns. Residents could hear, but not see, a battle from across the ocean. Fighting lasted for 7 days, with losses on both sides. Some would say it was mostly a draw. However, Japan's advances on Australia's far northern shores were stopped, and the damage incurred by their warships left Japan at a major disadvantage.
The Coral Sea sort of put an end to their plan for a seaborne attack, and of course later on Midway they then decided that they'd try and attack Port Moresby by land, and we all know the story of that, of the Kokoda track.
Hiding away on a farm in Moorabool, Cairns, there once was a well-known house called Fairview, or the House on the Hill. It was a large wooden Queenslander built by the first mayor of Cairns, equipped with a veranda all the way around and boasting 360-degree views of the mountains and the sea. This was very appealing to the Army during World War II. In 1942, the Army leased Fairview, and it became not only a communications headquarters, but also one of the few training schools across Australia for the secret heroes of the day, Special Units Z and M.
You had the House on the Hill, that was just where paratroopers used to train there. And that became, after, when the war finished, they turned that into like a nightclub sort of thing. It was there for years. But now it's all gone.
Well, the House on the Hill was that was owned by these two spinsters, Munro and Martin, and it was a big wooden building, and it was right on the tip of the hill up there, and Z Force was housed up there then.
Special Units Z and M had specific training exercises and would often raid the flying boats called Catalinas on Cairns Harbour, the planes at the Cairns airport, and even the House on the Hill itself. It was not only the Special Forces that were training in Cairns and the surrounds. Just outside of town at Trinity Beach and Palm Cove, the United States and Australia carried out combined amphibious training.
They would then run up the sand dunes so that they would be able to hide, and then climb the hills and back down again and repeat it over again. It was practice so that they could land under difficult circumstances and under enemy fire if necessary.
Between 1942 and 1945, Cairns was also home base for the Catalinas. These were large Empire flying boats equipped to drop bombs, conduct rescue and evacuation missions for civilians and soldiers in New Guinea, and carry out supply runs to crucial areas.
The Catalinas was the main air wing of the patrol section here.
The flying boats would take off and land from Trinity Inlet. Over 3,000 flights left Cairns in a period of 2 years, not all of them returning though. In 1942, the Royal Australian Artillery set up 2 large defensive gun emplacements at False Cape in East Trinity near Cairns. This also marked the arrival of powerful searchlights in Cairns. The great beams would search the sky at night for enemy aircraft. Some lights could be seen from the tablelands. Other times, returning Catalinas would be in bad shape or be battling rough weather, and a searchlight at the Cairns District Hospital would join up with a searchlight at the beach and at False Cape to create an arch and guide the planes to a safe landing. Sometimes these lights were used to communicate messages to one another across the sea or sky with coded flicker warnings.
False Cape was an important army setup there to guard the entrance to Cairns Harbour, which was very important for security. There were troops over there with ammunition, a big gun emplacement, and they had their own little village virtually where they lived.
Then, in 1943, the US Army enlisted the help of 24 Cairns women volunteers who were specially selected to be parachute packers. Training was set up at the Lyric Theatre and Norman Park in Gordonvale. The first jump was in June 1943 and landed just outside of town near Green Hill. It was a success, and this location continued to be used throughout the remainder of the war as a jump training ground. The parachute packers, or parabels, were recognised for their service with an award around 70 years later as civilians who supported soldiers.
Of course, being a parachute division, they did a lot of parachute jump training out at Green Hills, just outside of Gordonvale. And we as kids would get on the roof of the house and look at them and watch them jumping down.
With the large amount of military vehicles based in or passing through Cairns, fuel was of great demand and protection. While there were fuel tanks located near the wharf, construction of 2 steel and 3 concrete fuel storage tanks at Edge Hill were approved by the Allied Works Council in 1942, and building began in mid-1943. By the next year, 3 tanks had been completed and were being used for the storage of fuel for the Royal Australian Navy. The tanks were built on Mount Whitfield Range because it could be easily camouflaged with the help of the existing tall trees and was a difficult spot for an enemy to attack.
Oh yeah, the tanks, they were all to hold fuel, oil. I think they're mainly oil for all the boats and vehicles that were around the place, you know. But they were well camouflaged too, because they had all the big trees around them. The idea was that if the Japs that comes through with bombs and that, they couldn't see them. They were camouflaged.
The site was 5 kilometres from the city centre, meaning it was well away from any expected enemy action targeting the Cairns wharf. Construction also included an underground pipe that ran from Edge Hill to the wharf and Army Depot at Kenny Street. 8 tanks were originally planned, but only 5 were ever built. While the town had their own hospital on the Esplanade, the sheer number of soldiers based in Cairns and the Tablelands meant that additional bed space was required. With construction beginning in 1943, a new temporary hospital was built by the US Army on 38 acres of land near Redlynch. Named the Jungara United States Army Station Hospital, this impressive new hospital, which was prefabricated in Sydney, had over 140 wards, theatres and accommodation for the hospital staff, and included 750 beds for patients.
There was a big army hospital out at Redlynch, and you went round the Redlynch Hotel to get to Jungara, to the hospital, because my uncle was one of the residents there. And I honestly hadn't known that there was one there, but it was quite an education to go out there and see this hospital and how it was run. And we thought it was it's such a good spot out there because that was all farming area out that way. And so the atmosphere out there was much, much better than having in at the main hospital.
In March of 1944, the hospital was handed over to the Australian Army, and within 2 months it was offering services such as disease, malaria research and psychiatric services. Only 5 months later, on the 25th of October 1944, the large Rocky Creek Hospital on the Tablelands closed. Overseas, the war was coming to an end. Things sped up in April, with the deaths of the leaders of Italy and Germany and an official surrender from their countries, leaving only Japan still standing. The US wanted an end to the war and took drastic measures by dropping the first nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing the deaths of over 250,000 Japanese people. This led to Japan seeking immediate peace with the Allies.
The Army, as I said, they moved into the Tablelands in big strength, especially the 2 divisions. And from there on in, they stayed there until 1945 came along, and of course it was all finished.
On August 15th, 1945, it was announced that the war was finally over. This day was to be known forever as VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. On the 2nd of September, a formal surrender document was signed. In Cairns, the celebrations were immediate. Joyful people came into the street to make some noise. There were no coloured streamers, so the local newspaper provided colourful paper to civilians. People sang, drank, and embraced each other happily. Cars, trucks and bikes all joined in the parade.
I was a boarder at St Augustine's College in Draper Street, and all of a sudden we could hear all the bells and whistles in the city blaring out.
Yes, I was in town. I can tell you what I even wore that day. And I had red, white and blue on. And on my bicycle on Maslin's Corner. And yes, everyone was hooping and hollering and so forth, you know, it was just so nice.
Everyone was hugging each other and kissing, there was crying and, you know, and everyone was eating and feeding.
Almost overnight, everything changed. Temporary campsites were evacuated, streets were quiet again, no more hustle and bustle of army trucks. Units from across the country, and indeed the world, were allowed to return home. Army and Navy occupied buildings were returned to their rightful owners. Demolition sales came and saw everything that was left disappear.
But when the military left, and I meant the military, army and the Air Force, it left a big vacuum in the economy.
Cairns, even though it was battered with heavy army vehicles, had a vastly improved infrastructure. All up, the Main Roads Commission, along with the Allied Works Council, Army and the Volunteer Defence Corps had sealed the Gillies Range and Coranda Range roads, extended the railroads, reinforced bridges and improved wharf facilities. The Cairns and Mareeba aerodromes were larger and more equipped to handle heavier aircraft. An extensive malarial drainage system, 42 kilometres long, was in place. Many tableland roads and bridges had also been sealed and improved. Some familiar faces returned to the north, and some remained alive in the hearts of those who knew them. A new normal began. Although the war was devastating, it surprisingly enabled Cairns to grow in a positive way, particularly in terms of Cairns' infrastructure and medical and industrial development. In the short space of only 6 years, this was growth that may never have happened if it hadn't been for the war.
I think it more or less brought us closer together, really, you know, because the war affected a lot of people, eh? Because war, no one likes wars, they're nasty businesses, they really are. But yeah, it took a lot of people a long time to get over it. Some poor buggers never got over it, you know.
I felt that possibly might have been the start to changing my life from what I was a kid running around in the bush to what I turned out to be, wanting to join the Air Force, mainly because of being involved by watching aircraft, and I thought it was so wonderful. It was a time and part of the situation I don't think I've ever been sorry, and I'm glad that I could never ever forget it. It's part of my life, and that's the main part of it.